¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to this fifth plenary of the PDB's Fix 2023 Building Bridges Banks, Development Banks as catalyst for human rights. This plenary has important relevance today because in the summit last year in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, PDBs issue a statement where they committed to integrate human rights in policies and procedures, as well as in the awareness and capacity building activities. Taking into account that with this approach, it is of the utmost importance to have a safe environment where we have a real environment of non-discrimination, social justice, and equal opportunities. These PDBs are aware of the need to include human rights in their strategies, because only with this approach they can make certain that these funding efforts are really aligned with the Sustainable Development Objectives, leading towards more effective development results. We greet all the participants that joined virtually this session. Do not forget to take this important conversation to the social media using hashtag Finance in Common 2023, and please follow our accounts in Twitter and LinkedIn at Finance in Common to keep updated with the latest news. It is an honor to start this plenary introducing a message of the High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights, Volker Turk.
Excellencies, colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to address this summit and for shining a light on human rights in this plenary session. It is particularly apt as we mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year. I hope that human rights will be a regular agenda item for all future summits. The challenges to development have never seemed greater than they do now. Threats to our peace and security are reverberating around the globe. The food and cost of living crises continue to deepen, their effects most acutely felt by the world's poor. And the triple planetary crisis is endangering our very existence. In the face of such vast challenges, human rights must be our essential companion in the journey towards inclusive, sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals embody an integrated vision of human rights and development. The aims of the 2030 Agenda are clear: to dismantle discrimination, to promote equality, and to build societies which are peaceful, prosperous, and just. Public development banks play an essential role in addressing today's challenges and in helping achieve the SDGs. Many of the banks represented here have taken concrete, valuable measures to incorporate human rights within their operational policies and projects. Their social and environmental safeguard policies are increasingly integrating explicit and specific human rights requirements. In some respects, this is not new. For example, labor rights and the rights of indigenous peoples have long been part of many safeguard policies that banks have adopted. But many banks are now going even further, ensuring that their clients implement clear requirements on stakeholder engagement, non-discrimination, and protection against reprisals. I welcome the fact that numerous banks, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and the African Development Bank, now expressly require clients to address the project-related risks that are faced by LGBTIQ+ people. The issue of remedy is also slowly gaining traction. Rights without remedy are empty aspirations. A growing number of banks are requiring that harms should be remedied, not merely compensated or offset. Colleagues, despite this progress across the board, the picture remains mixed. For most development banks, there is still a long way to go to align safeguard policy requirements with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The consequences of this are vast. It also raises many questions. When human rights harms occur, who is responsible for addressing them? Despite progress we see on remedy, the circumstances in which banks themselves should contribute to it are rarely made clear. The concept of human rights due diligence is also not well understood or widely implemented in practice, which increases the likelihood of human rights harms. And when due diligence is implemented, it can be superficial in nature and exclude downstream impacts on users and consumers. The human rights risks related to rapid expansion of digital technology, for example, are rarely subject to contractually binding social and environmental requirements. Even where operational policies reasonably adhere to the UN Guiding Principles and other international human rights standards, we do not always see the level of leadership, technical support, and resources to implement stronger standards in practice. Internal incentives are not always aligned, and internal and external accountability are often weak. The UN Guiding Principles are the leading global standards for human rights in the context of business activities. They are aligned closely with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and other emerging national and regional regulatory frameworks. 12 years after their adoption, it is time that they be integrated into all risk management and sustainability frameworks of development banks. Today's forum offers a timely opportunity to discuss our shared operational challenges, identify solutions, and build partnerships and bridges towards more effective approaches and better development and human rights outcomes. I wish you all a productive session and look forward to exploring prospects for our future collaboration. Thank you.
Now I would like to welcome Ayana Tuta from the Danish Institute of Human Rights, who will be chairing this plenary and will guide discussions on the importance of implementing the approach based on human rights in PDBs. To start this conversation, I want to introduce the panel members this morning that will provide their contribution in this valuable discussion. Alice Mogwe, the President of the International Federation for Human Rights; Gerald Kanyan, Executive Director of the Twerchoneho Listeners Club from Uganda; Ewija Alicia Kawija, President of the Women Association, the Waronari Women of the Equatorian Amazon region; Dario Mejia, Chair of the Permanent Forum of UN on Indigenous Issues; and Claudia Conyat, the Deputy Director of ILO for Latin America and the Caribbean; Adonaye Martinez, Director of the Environment and Sustainability of the European Investment Bank. So Joanna has the floor to start this conversation. Good morning, everyone.
As you know, this is the third day of the summit, and if one word can be used to sum up the spirit of the conversation so far, that should definitely be urgency, right? Urgency to mobilize finance, urgency to forge new alliances, and so on. So I can say for sure that this panel is also about urgency, the urgency to discuss how development finance can be best channeled towards projects that meet the needs and visions of people. It is about the urgency to acknowledge that despite all the best intention, development finance can sometimes enable harms that need to be accounted for and remediated. And it's also about the urgency for more of the public development banks that I hope are in the audience will implement human rights-based approaches, which also means signing on to the statement on human rights that some banks have signed during the last year's summit. As some of you might know, this is really the first time that human rights are discussed during a plenary session at the summit. I would like to thank the organizers for enabling this conversation, but I would also like to reiterate the High Commissioner's recommendation that this should be a recurring and not a one-off agenda item. This is important, not only because the SDGs and human rights are really two sides of the same coin. It is important because human rights can serve as a reminder that the language of economics is not the only language available to discuss development. Other vocabularies revolving around equity, justice, empowerment, and even care are possible and necessary, not least because they have the potential to open up new possibilities for action in response to global challenges. And we have a truly inspiring panel today to help us explore and develop that vocabulary. So I will just turn to them for their insights. And I would like to start with Alice and Dario. You both represent institutions that seek to ensure that the voices of rights holders and indigenous people are being heard in global governance fora, such as this one. So I will throw at you a very foundational question. Why should public development banks respect human rights? Alice, you have the floor first.
Thank you very much. We do know, Ayana, that big development projects may have positive impacts on development for communities, but they can also have negative impacts. And these negative impacts can include environmental, where there are consequences for health, standards of living, access to water, reprisals against human rights defenders who are members of the community, erosion too of the social cohesion of communities, where there may be divisive strategies used to support the project, where there's inadequate sharing of information to enable genuine informed consent during stakeholder engagement processes, lack of true consultation, and violation of the rights of indigenous peoples. Volker Turk just spoke about that as well as the fueling of conflict and violence, because when we talk about land use and natural resources, these are often issues linked to community identity as well as to social cohesion. So when a project is in a context where there's a high rate of human rights violations, lack of remedies, poor adherence to rule of law, for example, we can imagine how difficult it can be for the banks, as well as for their clients, to operate within that space without either directly or indirectly contributing to human rights violations. So the question may be asked, how can banks therefore avoid this? Human rights due diligence is a process which does help to both prevent violations as well as offering a tool to assess the context and also to identify appropriate actions during the entire project cycle. And it's now a common international standard, in fact, which has begun to be used in the processes of some PDBs. Some of the challenges which may arise, in fact, really focus on the understanding of the human rights HRDD process and how to better integrate that into both the operations of the client as well as of the banks themselves. So you see, just saying, let's ensure that we take on a human rights approach is not sufficient. It needs to be a continuous, dynamic process involved in the process of identifying, preventing, mitigating, monitoring, as well as remediating actual as well as potential human rights impacts. And I'd like to stress throughout the entire project cycle. It's not, as you were saying earlier, it's not a one-off. And this human rights standard has been defined and operationalized in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were adopted in 2011. We do see, though, that some PDBs are able to absorb these, but in other cases, there is a challenge. The easiest way is really to ensure that these are linked to the SDGs, right? And we know, and I'm sure many people do know, that in 2015, the UN adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, together with the 17 SDGs, and that those speak to issues relating to human rights, rule of law, justice, etc. And you've also made reference to those. There was also the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, linked to the financing for development specifically, and that recognized the importance of financing sustainable development. But how does human rights fit into the bank space itself? Might be a question which may be asked. We're seeing that human rights requirements are increasingly being incorporated within financial regulations, disclosure regulations, corporate governance requirements, as well as mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. And we're also seeing social and environmental safeguard systems, as well as accountability mechanisms, which have also been reviewed and updated by many development banks. But in spite of that, we're still seeing violations happening. And I'd like to draw to a close by just pointing to a few recommendations, which I think may be helpful. The first is really calling upon PDBs to have high-level public policy commitments to respect and protect human rights. Secondly, a screening of potential human rights risks and impacts. And when we talk human rights, we're talking about all human rights, civil, political, social, economic, and cultural. Using a human rights risk assessment, a human rights impact assessment, ensuring that public consultations and information disclosure is done by both the client and the bank. Prevention and mitigation is critical, very important, of adverse human rights impacts, as well as monitoring and the remedying mechanism. So, in conclusion, human rights considerations are relevant in all the stages of the development bank's project cycle, from the initial consideration of business undertaking eligibility, through the safeguards application, through the project implementation and operation, as well as addressing complaints and actual negative impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice, for painting that very comprehensive picture as where we are and where we should be, right? I would like to turn my attention to Dario now, and I would like him to consider the same question of why development banks should respect indigenous people's rights.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. It is an honor to participate in this conversation. Is the first time that I address this forum on human rights. First, we need to know what are we talking about, because we talk about the same things, but we are not on the same places, on the same sites. It's not the same thing when we are going to implement these matters. Some initial data. Indigenous people, more than 5,000 indigenous people that we still have, 476 million people in 92 countries have been recognized, 6.2% of the population of the planet. And in these lands, in these territories, we see that there has been a reduction. Less than 20% of the land area and water are preserved. 80% of this biodiversity is preserved. That takes care of life on the planet. But something else that I think is important to emphasize is what the indigenous peoples are not, what they are not. These indigenous peoples are not the civil society. Indigenous peoples are not a minority. They are not ethnic groups. These indigenous people are not a category for planning or of the population, such as a vulnerable population or local communities. Indigenous peoples are basically subjects of rights. And for this reason, we have a support in the origin. These are societies, cultures, government that exist before the states were established. And they have not handed over to the states the right to be represented within the international system. They have their own voice. And these period. We have advanced. We have 3 types of categories in the word: individual rights, we have collective rights, and then we have the rights of these collective subjects of rights. This is what we are speaking about, the rights of collective subjects of rights that base their livelihood and the support, rather, on its existence. I have been listening to the role of indigenous people, their contribution, and the first invitation that I should make here is that we need to start action on this good intention, to move from these very nice declarations to actions. And this implies not to take for granted some of the terminology that has been used on economic matters, for example, bioeconomics or nature-based solutions, because for indigenous people, this division between culture and nature is a fiction. The source of the right has to do with the elements of nature. These elements of nature are the ones that have rights and give guarantees to human beings, and not just the opposite. From this perspective, I think that there's an opportunity that we have to discuss and to mention the knowledge that has allowed the diversity of the planet to be taken care of, this way to absorb this pollution, these sponges available because of the knowledge of these indigenous issues and people, and the public banks to support these ODS. And we need, however, an open dialogue. These indigenous peoples want to be part on the discussion, but to have a seat where they could let their voices be heard. Banks have an opportunity to make up a work group to talk about rights of these indigenous people, to adopt the declaration of the UN on the rights of indigenous people as a guide to guide operations and the relation with governments, because governments at different levels are the ones that finally will implement policies, and finally we hope that they can establish a common fund to promote actions of the indigenous people, that is the implementation of their rights, because this is the main climate action that is showing results at the level of the planet. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dario, and thank you for challenging some of the concepts and distinctions that we're so used to operating with. And I think it speaks to my okay, I hope I'm, yes. Okay, so it speaks to my preliminary observations about how important it is to expand the vocabularies we use when engaging. Okay, so the mic is working now, and I would like to turn my attention to Alicia and Gerald. You are both having, first-hand experience witnessing some of the environmental and social impacts connected to investments and development projects. So I would like to ask you to help us travel to the places where you're conducting your important work, and please paint a picture for us of the harms that your work is being focused on. Alicia, do you want to start first?
Waponin baneki miniti miri amopa yemunki miniti potoki yasunin pontapopa waponin baneki. Buenos días, mi nombre es.
Good morning, my name is Huella Caguilla. I come from the Guarani people, and I am a director of Guarina. Why are we here? I have come from our territory, women, men, of the Amazon Wazuni territory. We have suffered in our territory Before it was healthy. Now they have come to our territory. They have opened roads, huge roads. They have taken the cemetery of our grandparents and the river that we were using in order to cook and to drink with our family. We have an oil spill. In Yasunin, more than 20 spills that we have had in the Amazon region. We as women, we have organized to say to the world to listen, because Amazon is unique. It's the only lung in the world that we feel as an Amazon woman, as indigenous women. We are telling, that you, like now, banks that are financing the companies, the oil companies, mining companies, to these companies, you give the government the money, they say. But we in the Amazon area, we do not live with the dollar, but our economy, we are having, with our effort, we plant palms to do chambira, the use of our handicraft. We have succeeded by ourselves because we do take care of the environment. We share, we coexist in the Amazon area because we have our pharmacy, our medicine, our spirituality, and the spirituality is in our knowledge, connection with the forest we have. So we have, as a Guarani woman, we are claiming. But when we were complaining with a spill in the Amazon region, we are going after the government so as to be quiet and not to say anything. But the Amazon is our home, the home of the lung of the world. So these banks, we are going to say to the banks that they need to, I think you think to invest the money, but in the Amazon region, they are destroying our home instead of giving us money to destroy. But now we're telling the companies and the banks that they have to pay for that Amazon, as the banks, companies, oil companies, and the governments, because in the Amazon, in the indigenous people, we are maintaining these for mankind. So banks must be aware. They are going to tell, oh, we are going to give money to the indigenous people, but why are we going to destroy the Amazon region? Our life is in risk. So we need to say that the governments should understand, because we are an autonomous people. Before the state arrived, we were there. It's our home. They should respect the Amazon region, because as women, we're saying that in the Yasuni, more than 10 years, 50 years, taking out oil, the IDB fund in Ecuador, but we have not improved. The Amazon, it has been unsafe life, destroying the Amazon region, destroying the polluted waters with oil spills. We are not going to have the food for us or the meat for us. We want also, we as indigenous people, each indigenous people have a life plans, so that the organizations like I hear that the Green Fund are investing, but where is the justification to say this area is being preserved? The states, when they want to take out oil, they destroy us. With these funds, they invest for the oil companies and mining companies. We do not agree that to harm the Amazon region, because we are under risk. We are losing the water for our consumption. So I ask you to talk to the different people and nationalities as indigenous people, not only the banks that will go to invest or local governments. They took the money and the money left, but they are finishing, they are affecting the Amazon. We are under risk. We do have risk because the governments are always attacking us, saying that they cannot let oil companies to get in. But we want to have our life. We want the whole Amazon region. We are in danger. We are having danger for our life, for our health. I want for you to understand that the culture, the language is important, but if the companies will get in, they will destroy us, and we will be losing our culture, our language. We are under risk. We live isolated in the Amazon region. The isolated people that live there, we have to guarantee security and food so they can live. But we live in the same territory and we are having problems. So this is what I want to say.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for your powerful words and really crystal clear messages to those in the room. Gerald, do you want to speak about your experience in Uganda?
Thank you. Once again, I take this opportunity to re-echo my colleagues' concerns, and I represent a Ugandan organization called Twirwaneho Listeners Club. I also belong in the big group of the Coalition for Human Rights in Development, an entity that brings together advocates trying to talk about responsible development and respect for human rights and the planet. One of the biggest concerns that most people do not pay attention to is when we talk of development, we all think of the nice things, but we do not look at the potential risk this could have to a common person, to a local person who is the sole intended beneficiary of this development. I've had the opportunity to work with local communities, and in the last 2 years, my work has directly brought me into contact with over 13 million people potentially impacted by development projects. And I'll just get direct into the kind of harms communities are experiencing on a daily basis. She's from speaking about the rights of the indigenous people. Over 400,000 fisher folks on Lake Albert and Lake Edward have been negatively impacted by one of the development finance conservation projects, where fishermen who have survived on these lakes for ages have been stopped from accessing their ancestral sites and also a source of livelihood that has been keeping their children go to school and feeding them, under the disguise that indigenous communities will need development, and this development has to destabilize their way of life and living. Most projects we talk about have an element of limited consultations or stakeholder engagement. And this, in a way, has negated the responsibility of banks and the clients from looking at the crucial aspects of development from a community perspective. Most of these aspects mainly focus on the bank's perspective and not community perspectives. And in the end, what happens is that communities are always in conflict because what is given to them is not what they value. As a result, we have seen communities' property being destroyed because they have to be evicted for a dam to be constructed. We have seen roads pass through communities and communities go on empty stomach because a road has to pass through their land and they are not going to be compensated. Or if compensation is going to be made, it will be made after so many years. And most times these are displaced communities that will not be able to access the same pieces of land. In other cases, finance projects do not also implement critical environment and social mitigation measures outlined in the environment and social management plans, intended to strengthen the capacities and skills of these communities. I'll go back to another conservation project. When banks are financing projects, they only look at the goals and not look at the sustainability of the livelihood of these communities. I mentioned at the beginning that we are talking about 13 million people potentially impacted by a project, and these are people who go without feeding, these are people who have children, who have stopped going to school, and these are communities that have tried to resist this destabilization, and in the end they're being targeted with physical confrontations. We've recorded over 100 community members killed within these communities because they try to resist and speak loud about their voice. Others do not pay special attention to reducing inequality that deliver gender mainstreaming goals. We have projects where women have been used as a tool to scare away, women have been exploited as a tool to scare away communities and create room for investment. In one of the projects we've been working on, women were sexually exploited just to be able to access markets to sell their fish. For a woman to go and sell her fish, she has to be sexually exploited by the enforcement body in order to access a market, sell fish, and feed her family. And these are experiences I hope banks do not want to think about because this is not the intended goal of the investment they support. We have also encountered projects characterized by excessive use of force during the process of surveillance and monitoring missions. And this is direct money that is financed by banks projects. While speaking to you today, I'm one of the few people, while I can have the space to speak here, I'm one of the people also being targeted as a voice to silence what happens to a local person who does not have a platform like this one. And this is why we need to keep raising these voices. This is why we need to take retaliation, and banks should take a position on retaliation serious. Because if Gerald, who is on this platform, can speak, what about a fisher folk who is fending for just to get 5 fish to feed his family or maybe sell, take a child to school? Is an easy target and get silenced without anyone noticing. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that reality check. I think after all these interventions, it is clear why this discussion is long overdue and the urgency of taking action on what we have kind of exposed so far. I would like now to give a chance to Adonai, who's representing an organization that has endorsed the statement on human rights during last year's summit. I would like to ask, why did your bank did so, and how would you assess the progress within the bank to turn that vision into reality?
Well, thank you, Joanna, and thanks the organizers for inviting the EBRD to speak here today on this important topic. I feel that after the statement from the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the interventions of our colleagues, especially Valis, my points are repeating many of the points that you've made. And I'd like to say that I'm here representing the human rights specialists within my team that are the true experts on the topic, right? In a nutshell, human rights is essential to our work, to the work of public development banks, because it provides us with the social license to operate. Without the respect of human rights, there's no reason for us to work in the countries where we work. And I'll summarize how we integrate human rights in our work in 4 main areas. One, how it influences our mandate as EBRD. We're quite unique as a public development bank, and I'll summarize the bank in a second. How that trickles into our strategies and policies, especially on the environmental social policy. How that influences projects, and what are the feedback loops that we have in place to correct the work we do. Those feedback loops are based on our engagement with the civil society organizations and our independent project accountability mechanism. Those are the main 2 feedback loops. But first of all, what is the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development? We are private sector focused, project focused, public development bank, a multilateral development bank, created in 1991 to promote the transition to fully operating market economies of the former Soviet Union. So in a way, rather different to the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, that are public banks focus on public sector projects, right? We work bottom up with private sector investors, which makes the integration of human rights topics rather unique. Since we were created in 1991, the charter funding the EBRD reflected a commitment to the fundamental principles of multi-party democracy, rule of law, respect for rule of law and respect for human rights, which are intrinsic part of our charter. And that's rather unique because, again, the bank was created, between quotes, recently. And those founding principles of respect for human rights and multi-party democracy trickle down in our country strategies. We perform political country assessments that then emphasize human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, religion, etc. They emphasize those aspects into the country strategies. Then that assessment will educate what is our project investment plan for the countries. So we take human rights into consideration in the plan for our investments to a certain extent that when we perceive that human rights are not respected by the governments where we invest, we might focus only on private sector investments, 100% of private sector investments, or even not invest at all in the country, which is actually happening right now in some countries where we traditionally operated. But then how do those strategies translate into projects? Through mostly, since human rights is a cross-cutting theme, we reflect human rights in our environmental social policy and access to information policy as well. In the so-called performance requirements, that is conditions, and I think Alice and the Commissioner referred to those. These are the requirements that clients need to implement in the projects we finance. And we have there requirements on labor and working conditions, health and safety and security, land acquisition and land use, indigenous peoples, even though our region of operations does not cover countries with so many indigenous peoples, maybe some in Siberia, but elsewhere we don't operate in those kind of countries, but still we have a performance requirements on the indigenous peoples and access to information, disclosure, and stakeholder engagement. We implement these principles through our environmental social due diligence, assessing the risks of projects based also on human rights risks. And Alice mentioned the assessment of risks and impacts, potential impact of projects. So we categorize projects based on this, and that informs the due diligence that then we launch. That due diligence is translated into an environmental social action plan that actually aims at closing the gaps between our policy and the current design of projects to make sure that projects are in line with good practices, good international practice, including the respect of human rights. Those SAPs, those environmental social action plans, are intrinsic part of the loan agreements. So basically they are legally binding. So not complying with those documents is a breach of contract, and we could actually recall our loan due to those issues, right? Due to the not meeting the commitments. And then ultimately, we monitor that those environmental social action plans are actually being implemented. We include grievance mechanisms for affected stakeholders that should be both anonymous and independent to make sure that people have a voice on the impacts of projects, even during the implementation and finalization. I realize that my time is up, so I need to speed up. And if things go wrong, we try our best, but if things go wrong, we have an independent project accountability mechanism, which keeps us on our toes and making sure that we properly apply our policy. So this, in a way, is the summary of how we internalize human rights into our process. And I understand we might not perfectly implement our policies, and that is why every 5 years, we update our policy. Right now, we are updating our environmental social policy, so if you have feedback to provide, there is an ongoing consultation process for you to share your voice. And I think with that, I think I can close the intervention. Thank you, Jona.
Thank you, Adonai, and I think that's a good segue. I think that's a good segue to the next segment of the discussion, and I would like to spend something like 20-25 minutes discussing the important topic of stakeholder engagement. As you know, and as the High Commissioners mentioned, engaging affected groups, engaging stakeholders is a critical expectation under business and human rights standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles. But what does this actually mean in practice? So I would like to zoom in a bit on this aspect to give our audience a panoramic perspective about how this expectation can be implemented. And for that, I would like to start with Claudia. You've been patiently waiting for your time to speak, and thank you for that. You are representing the International Labour Organization, and as we know, this is the only UN agency that is tripartite in nature. And I assume you have first-hand experience of the healthy friction involved in bringing together at the same table stakeholders with diverging perspectives. So please tell us more about that and how banks specifically can make sure that workers' rights and voices are being heard when investment decisions are taken.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's great. It's an honor to be here on this panel. And I want to also just start by congratulating the organizers for having put this item, this theme on one of the main panels. It's showing that it is becoming more of a recognized priority, and the declaration that was established in 2022 is another testimony of that. And it was actually great to hear Adonai also sort of call a little bit on how it can work in practice, which is good. Now, when we look at the stark realities facing the world in general, and more specifically in the ILO perspective at the world of work, it's both brave, because it's not easy, but it's also absolutely essential that we bring the social, the economic, and the environmental dimensions of our societies more closely together. This is, after all, what the SDGs was all about, or is all about. It's about changing the lens through which we look and really recognizing that those three elements are not just complementary, but they're absolutely interdependent. And actually, we've heard it before, but today, when we look at where we are in the targets of the SDGs, we have 50% only of the targets that are on track. So it's a signal that we have quite some way to go. We see enormous rising inequality, lightning speed of transitions, growing disconnect between people and institutions that serve them. We got the memo, right? And we've seen many initiatives, calls for a new global social contract by the Secretary General of the UN, an initiative on global social justice coalition by the ILO Director General, and the FICS coalition, Finance in Common Coalition on Social Investments. All of them are actually invitations to work together, but to work harder together. And actually, what is really great about the Coalition on Social Investment is that it really is specifically also including labor issues for sustainability. Everything that ranges from employment creation, in new infrastructure, skills, decent jobs, working conditions, etc. So we've well prepared the ground. How do we do it? An element that was already mentioned was social safeguards. And social safeguards are excellent, great to have, and increasingly introduced, but we need to actually expand them beyond, in a way, thinking of the box to really make it, or beyond compliance, to really helping countries and stakeholders be able to be compliant. So the whole issue of capacity building is an important one, and it has to be a collaboration between governments, banks, other stakeholders, expert organizations or groups. Another important specific step that the banks can take is to join the global accelerator on job creation, social protection, and just transition. Why am I bringing this in here? Because this is really an opportunity to join forces, to enter into a virtuous cycle. We often say it's so important to have job creation, but we don't really move into the steps on how to do it. And joining the Global Accelerator can really help us to do that. Now, you asked me the question about stakeholder engagement, and I apologize for taking some time before I get into that, but I thought it is important to also, from the ILO perspective, talk a little bit more about the why and the how. Now, stakeholder engagement is not only the right thing to do, it is absolutely the smart thing to do. Banks need it for defining and implementing their vision. They need it to make sure that the interventions are sustainable, that the money that's invested serves the purpose. They need it to create innovative solutions, to create ownership, to create win-win solutions where there are costs involved, and it happens many times. Now, I would say the process is as important as the result. Yes, it will bring friction, but it's healthy, it's normal, it's essential, and it takes time. The ILO has a lot of experience in stakeholder engagement. It's the bread and butter of what we do, or I should say of how we operate. And the ILO can support development banks in engaging constructively with workers and employers' organizations to ensure that their voices are and their interests are considered in banks' projects to increase sustainability of investments. We have many examples, just one to mention in Iraq, where we worked with the World Bank and with IMF, bringing in the workers' organizations to get agreement on pension reforms. Definitely not an easy process. Now, anyone, and I don't know if anyone in this room, but anyone who has participated in the International Labour Conference discussions when we produce new labor standards knows that this stakeholder engagement can be quite painful. It often means long nights, it often means difficult moments of tension, but it also means that at the end we come to victorious feelings once we have a result. And it is really, in the end, and these are my last words to that, but it is about compromise. It's about creating a climate of trust. And creating a climate of trust, you don't just force that. You do that by being transparent, by being consistent, by being responsible. In fact, good stakeholder involvement means really applying the skills of emotional intelligence and values of integrity and accountability. When you do this, your results are actually sustainable because you get the buy-in that you need. So the process is long, but it's also the only way you can win, and it works if you really put in the principles that lie behind it to make it work. Thanks, Joanna.
Can you hear? Okay, so a swap of microphones always works. Thank you for being very honest about the fact that stakeholder engagement is hard. Sometimes we like things to be quick and easy. And I think that acknowledgement and recognition, is important in order to get it right, because we know what to expect, right? So thank you for that. And Alicia, I would like to turn my attention to you. And you've already touched a bit upon this in your previous intervention, but I wanted to kind of give you a chance to craft a message for financial institutions that might be considering to invest in projects that affect upon indigenous people's lands and livelihoods. What would you tell banks to consider before doing that?
I would like to tell the banks that the banks, first, they should consult indigenous people at the global level so that, as they say, sustainable development. We do have our territory, we have tourism, handicraft, medicine as indigenous people, but they have to invest on the originary people, direct people, because the banks are usually financing the government and the resources will not reach us. So I want to ask these, if indigenous people, we are aware of the development that we want. In the Equatorian Amazon region, we work on the handicraft, reforesting palms, and we do handicraft in order to have a local economy. And community tourism, we work, we have not appeal to the banks, but we have local entrepreneurship. I mean, women and men and young men are living. And I want to recommend also the banks not to finance the companies, the oil and mining companies, because they affect us, but they should give the money to the mining and oil companies in our territory that will affect, because they will build roads and they will open oil rigs, and with that money the waters are polluted. So this is the risk. I want to also say that in the Amazon we do have, as the indigenous people, we have our own pharmacy, gym, spirituality. We all have all that, and we want this territory to be respected, because we do have a cosmovision. We have an investment plan for indigenous people. We have a lifeline for, and that plan should be talked to the organizations so they can work. Because if not, you are giving money. In Ecuador, what happens in Ecuador? The environment in Ecuador, they ask money for the government. The Ministry of the Environment will take the money, but it will never get to the indigenous territory. It's our home. In Yasuni, we have recently said we have won as Waorani. We have been we are saying that no more exploitation. We voted for the Yasuni consultation, and we won in this consultation. We want this territory to be respected as Waorani territory. The NGOs and the corporates must have partnerships in order to finance the people that are struggling, to have the example of Ecuador, that what's for you to see the world. And indigenous people, we have to decide to adopt our position. We have an autonomous territory, and that should be respected by the government. The message is not only the fight as indigenous people. It's not just for the indigenous person in the territory. The territory is global. What are we leaving for your children and for our children? For that reason, we as indigenous people will say, stop. The governments should not make business in our territory. We have to look at the future. The seas are contaminated, rivers are polluted. What are we leaving for mankind to the future? You have to be aware about what are you going to leave for your future generations, for the indigenous children and for your children. This is only what I say.
Thank you.
I want to say something else that I forgot. This is not my own language, so I apologize because I do not speak. This is not my native language, it's Spanish. In the Amazon, but as well regionally, we see contamination, oil leaks. We see roads that have destroyed, have contaminated rivers, and oil companies, the government, the banks, they would have to pay for this, the way they have harmed the Amazon region. The governments in the region have a debt to pay for this Amazon region so that we can recover the Amazon region that has been contaminated by mining, by oil and deforestation. This is what I want to say. Thank you.
Alicia, and thank you for reminding us that your work is actually on behalf of all of us, and that is a work for future generations. Gerald, as you told us, you have worked with hundreds of communities to support them in their struggles for rights, and you probably have a lot of insights as to what it takes to, get community engagement right. can you share some insights that hopefully will, serve also as recommendations for development banks when they are considering on how to actually implement their commitments in practice?
Thank you. She has just emphasized that people are not against development. They're only against development that excludes them. And there are over 100 civil society organizations and human rights defenders who think banks should actually change their policies and processes at how they look at development and how they finance or conduct their work. Just ahead of this summit, over 100 civil society organizations and human rights defenders signed a declaration still calling upon banks to consider the environment and human rights and the planet as a key component within their financing strategy. And this still underpins the relevance of stakeholder engagement. From the communities I come from, and of course from civil society, we think stakeholder engagement should actually consider these as key aspects. One is engage communities across all aspects of human rights due diligence. Communities, as a part of a strategic business decision, have potential to increase risk to human rights. So the involvement is quite crucial that we have the lenses of the risk this may have on human rights. Then also engage communities in the design and evaluation of actions for mitigating human rights risks. Engage communities as a part of the designing for and taking the role in remedy. Most times banks talk about remedy. The threshold to submit a complaint alone and get registered is quite high, and most communities may not afford that. And this is a gap. This is a challenge for most communities to access remedy. The second point is close the feedback loop with communities about how their inputs have impacted business practice and decisions. Every time communities are engaged, there must be a kind of feedback. How has your decision, how has your input contributed, how has community input contributed or impacted the welfare, the well-being and decisions of the bank? And this should be timely, and this should bring decision makers and communities closer together. There should be a link between communities and the bank decision makers. Just make sure that there is continued feedback. The third aspect is establish and nurture relationships, not transactions with communities. She has been emphasizing, and what is actually happening, depending on her conversation, is just a transactional relationship. It's not like a honest, genuine relationship between communities and banks. And this negates the role of banks and its obligations towards communities. So by establishing and acting in accordance with mutual expectations about these relationships, we will see the beginning will be a little bit turbulent, but this is necessary because we must have shared understanding. We must build consensus and look at how development must look like. And finally, collaborate to engage voices from impacted or likely to be impacted communities. Because most times, voices from communities that speak about the harms are targeted or most times are silenced. We've had quite a number of plenary sessions and of course side events where banks have always been thinking there is a misunderstanding between communities, civil society and the banks. But we need now to build a forum where these voices are welcome. The bad voices, the loud voices, the good voices should all be received in the same way. And this will strengthen the way we look at stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all those excellent points. Alice, I would like to round off this conversation with a question to you, who you're representing Federation of Civil Society Organizations. And what role do you think that organizations such as yours can play in enabling positive outcomes in the investments that banks are doing?
Thank you. I think even before that, it's important that for banks, adopting a rights-based approach means that the concept has to be made visible not only in words, but in how they do their work and what they do. So, of course, we've got an example of the words. We've had declarations to which somebody did refer. The Declaration of 2020 recognized just, inclusive, and rights-based transition being imperative. The Declaration of 2021 recognized the role of civil society and committed to structured dialogue with civil society. And the Declaration of 2022 committed to progressively integrating human rights-based approaches in their activities. Now, we have to shift into how it's done. The first way of that being done is the designing and implementation of projects in ways which benefit communities. And Alicia has very aptly given examples of how that could be done. Another example, a civil society example, is one of a tool, an FIDH methodology called COBRA, Community-Based Human Rights Impact Assessment. It's a bottom-up, community-owned approach which uses human rights standards as a benchmark. It compares law in theory and law in practice to measure risks and actual impacts and identifies human rights responsibilities of the different actors involved. The second way is the use of an inclusive approach to engage with civil society through structured dialogue, as they had been committed to in December. And Gerald has already made reference to, for example, the Civil Society Declaration of 2023. And this Civil Society Declaration actually makes recommendations concerning 4 themes: human rights, civil space, strengthening of CSO-PDB's relations, development finance, as well as climate, biodiversity, and sustainability. And this is a way in which engagement with civil society can proceed. As we recall, however, that wonderful declaration of 2022 was only publicly endorsed by 5 institutions. And so commitments were made in that declaration to enhance clients' dialogue with human rights civil society organizations, as well as support awareness-raising activities. We were greatly encouraged, however, that since then a multi-stakeholder working group has been established, which comprises civil society, banks, international organizations as well. And its objectives are focusing on how to ensure and to support PDB's engagement with stakeholders, to encourage PDBs to put in place strong human rights due diligence and monitoring procedures, to facilitate exchange of views and good practices, to collaborate on awareness raising of PDBs and their clients to ensure that human rights challenges and risks are better addressed. An example of this, again from civil society, is this recent study which was done by Bankwatch. And we heard about that in one of the side events yesterday. And that study was done in collaboration with FIDH, and it analyzes practices of the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Agence Française de Développement. And thirdly, environmental responsibility and accountability really means that all aspects, and I'll stress that, of the project need to be taken into account in order to anticipate implications. And to wrap up, just 5 specific recommendations. The first is ensuring there's an internal policy of commitment. Gerald's spoken about the need to have a real deep engagement and commitment to underlying values. Secondly, defining and understanding human rights by referencing it to international Bill of Rights as a minimum, because we know that they're regional human rights instruments as well. But using the international bill as a minimum, adopting a holistic approach which respects the indivisibility of human rights, and I made reference to that earlier on, and access to information, freedom of expression, and freedom of association are particularly important because the exercise of those is what leads human rights defenders to experiencing reprisals. Thirdly, developing of specific policies and procedures to protect communities, human rights defenders, and civil society. And fourthly, to be alive to the common negative impacts of development projects. And finally, developing human rights and environmental due diligence policies. We do, however, note that even though some of the public development banks have got strong development and human rights mandates, we still have cases of human rights abuses. And we've heard from our colleagues on the panel that this is continuing. FIDH does welcome the ongoing process of engagement with civil society, and we support the declaration of 2022. But we do strongly encourage banks which have not publicly committed to please commit, to ensure that they progressively integrate human rights-based approaches in their activities. And you may wonder why all of this is important. We keep saying what is good for sustainable development is what will make for good ethical business practices. And I'd like to finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you for reiterating the importance of closing the gap between policy and implementation, and maybe in that spirit of honesty, as Claudia did, I will ask Adonai to kind of give us a sense of where he thinks that progress still needs to be made at the bank to be able to deliver on the policy commitments.
Okay. Thank you, Joanna. And I'd like to point out the point that Claudia made before, that this ultimately is an issue of trust, right? So trust is something that needs to be gained patiently and slowly and can be lost very quickly. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we walk the talk. And I'd like to acknowledge that while we try our best to integrate human rights as well as other social and environmental considerations in our projects, that's not always, it's not always perfect. The projects are not always perfect. And that's why we have a steering committee on human rights, and we have feedback workshops with civil society that are informing us on what are the elements which we should integrate in our new environmental social policy. And I'd like to actually thank the work we do with the CSO, especially with Bankwatch, on this front. And as recently as last night, I was working with one of our colleagues from Bankwatch who was poking my speaking points and pointing out what are the elements that we need to improve. So I'm personally very grateful for that feedback. First point, as MDBs, we need to allocate more resources to fully implement our environmental social policies. And we need to make sure that we monitor that implementation properly, because even in my team, we focus very much on the ex-ante work, with the work that is done for project preparation, but then the monitoring, which is less glamorous and more cumbersome, is sometimes not forgotten, but put at a second stage. So we need to focus more on the monitoring of the gaps that existed, that were identified, and the monitoring on the implementation of projects. And we need to go beyond the client information and actually engage with the local communities to see how projects are being implemented. We do those engagements for very high-risk projects, but perhaps we need to engage local communities even more. We need earlier stakeholder engagements and CSO participations in the preparation of projects. And we need to, we need to better, this is an important point, better assess and mitigate supply chain risks. And this is an important point because the environmental social policies of MDBs were developed decades ago to focus on projects. Remember that the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was built to reconstruct Europe after the Second World War. So the policies that were put in place were focused on projects. But in a globalized world where supply chains are completely interconnected, we need to look at the impacts beyond our projects, beyond our clients, to the upstream suppliers and the downstream value chain, right? And that is important because we might be doing damage on both sides without knowing. And that links to disclosure. And I think Alicia made an excellent point on the need to stop working with clients or with clients that work with clients that destroy value, that do not respect human rights, and that they have an impact on the climate as a global good or on biodiversity and ecosystems as a local common good, right? So disclosure and understanding of linkages in supply chains is essential for mainstreaming human rights in our processes. And finally, I would say we need to think about incentives for clients to do the right thing. How can we stimulate our clients with technical assistance, free technical assistance, with financial incentives for clients to actually be aware of what human rights risks are and do the right thing beyond focusing on implementing their projects, which is what they care about ultimately. But in conclusion, there's still work to be done, and we need to make sure that our projects both substantially contribute to sustainable development, which is the main goal of our operations as public development banks, but also that those projects bring benefits or at least do no harm to local communities through these safeguards that we have in place, including the respect for human rights. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Adonai. And we look forward to hearing on how the bank has progressed on these items next year at the summit. Okay, so we have a few minutes left of the plenary, and I would really like to give the chance to the audience to ask some questions. So before wrapping up, I would like to just ask Claudia and Dario, to tell us about what a human rights-based approach to the energy transition would look like from the perspective of just transition, which I know is a concept that ILO is working hard to promote, but also from the conception of indigenous people's rights, Dario. So I will start with you, Claudia, and then I will finish with Dario. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for the question. And yes, I know we want to leave time for some interaction with the public, so I'll try to be really short. First of all, I'd say, you cannot have a sustainable energy transition if we don't also include a human rights approach. And it goes back to, the lens through which we need to look, that social, economic, and environmental have to go together. It seems to take us many years before we really internalize that for policy making. But I think it's really a point that will always stand in the way if we don't follow it. In the ILO, we have actually been, and much of what we see is that, in fact, the economic transformation that is being required by the Paris Agreement, or by the goals set in the Paris Agreement, has actually the potential to make the world even more unjust. And I think it's really important to be aware of that, because it's the poorest people who suffer the most from climate events, and because they have the least means to counter the consequences. And there is also a situation with countries that, in fact, are sort of forced into lower economic growth rates by making transitions, whereas they don't have opportunities, much fiscal space for doing it otherwise. And I think it's really important to be aware of those elements when we think about policy making. We talk about a human-centered approach, where people matter, and where when we make policy, economic policy decisions, we also look at the effect it has on people. That's what we call where we come to the concept of a just transition. And so basically, for a just transition to happen, which really means to make the transition fair and inclusive, we need 3 ingredients. We need broad-based consensus, that means social dialogue with everybody who sits on the panel and many more. We secondly need, of course, investments in technology, infrastructure, in nature-based solutions, and we need investments in people. We need investments in labor market institutions so that people can walk along with the changes that are happening with the climate transitions and the energy transitions that we're making. So creating new skills needs, thinking about entrepreneurship opportunities and supporting that, helping with social protection for people who lose their jobs and who need to move into new jobs. All of these elements together is really what the concept of just transition means, which is also encapsulated in the ILO guidelines that were formally adopted in the last conference. I will actually stop here because I'm aware of the time, and I know that we also want to listen to Alicia. So thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And I think you would be happy to continue the conversation after this plenary session if there is interest. So we will be in the coffee area so that I know you had much more to say. Dario?
Muchas gracias nuevamente.
Thanks again. I want to start with a concrete example. I know an indigenous people where wind is a live and sacred good. And these people, the communication between people that are here and those that have died is carried out by birds and by bats. This is a land, a territory where wind walks frequently around in some places. So the other knowledge identified that there is another potential for wind energy, electric generation. But to establish these wind parks in those areas where is the home of these sacred people, and this will affect the birds that bring the messages, and that are like the message between these people that have died and those that are alive. So how this type of transition to produce low emission carbon wind energy will generate justice, epistemological justice, political justice, and social justice in these indigenous people, but we have rather the possibility that the system of knowledge of these people could disappear. This is what we are talking about. In some cases, the human perspective of rights is restricted for the purpose that we should have as a common purpose. Which is the common purpose or objective of those here? The main objective is to make certain that we save and keep protect human life in the planet. These risk rating agencies should take into account the risk of the human race to disappear, because we are going beyond these lines of no return. Those people affected by natural disasters, for example, or high temperatures, this line of non-return have been crossed. So this is the first point that we have to take into account. What is the common objective that join us, and which is the most important risk element to work jointly? I heard in this scenario some of the speakers that said the most important thing for the Amazon region, for example, is to make it alone, to leave it alone. And some people say, no, we cannot do it. We have to do something with the Amazon region. And I want to be very specific. To leave it alone does not mean not to do anything. Just the opposite. To leave alone means to make a collective effort, because it implies to unlearn, to recover, to revitalize, to restore the memory of the land, of the territory, our own memory as a human being, our own consciousness and awareness. So there have been large efforts, and I think that this is an opportunity today for what has been called this second action. We have been invited to do and hold a review of the financial system. I want to invite you, so that in this collective team that will be established, I hope, on human rights of the indigenous people, we should see who is getting value, how much is the cost of a system of knowledge, what is the value of the system of knowledge of each bank, or what is the value of the knowledge of the indigenous people that have taken care of the diversity of the planet. And what means capability, because sometimes resources, finances have to do with capability. Is able or not? They have technical teams, financial knowledge, but this is not which guarantees to be efficient in climate action. Finally, transition, where to? If we don't have a world where we can live, so where are we moving forward? Which direction? First, we have to review this model to make certain that we should have a world to think about that specific time of history. Thank you again.
Conversation with those thoughtful questions that I think we should keep asking and, progressing on finding collectively an answer to. And I would like now to give the chance to our patient audience to ask a few questions. I'm looking at the time, and we we are past the time now, but I think the organizers will be gentle and allow, 3 questions from the floor, right? We have 8 minutes. Okay. I'm glad to hear. Okay, then let's get a few questions from the floor. Yes, okay.
Thank you very much. My name is San Bilal from ECDPM. I wanted to do just quickly 2 things. First, to flag the fact that we have done, at the request of PDBs, a very practical study on what does it mean for PDB to take into account human rights into their functioning. So it's a study that you can find also on the Finance in Common Summit website. I just wanted to highlight the fact that we have been talking about human rights in terms of how to prevent PDBs to do harm to human rights. And, so this do no harm principle seems to be very important. And for PDBs, it's perceived as a risk and which should be taken for the whole project cycle and not just ex ante, as we heard. I wanted to make the link that there's a strong connection also with the complaint mechanism of the PDBs. We have also made very concrete recommendations to PDBs after broad consultations of what they can do in the complaint mechanism. But I wanted to stress the fact that PDBs have a broader role. This is not only do no harm, but to support human rights and to enhance human rights. Because if we think simply on do no harm, there's also the risk that PDBs decide not to go in areas that are a bit more tricky, where there might be problems of human rights, and simply decide to disengage. And I think what we want for PDBs is to be very active also in the more fragile contexts, in the more difficult contexts. So they should be able to think about what could be their positive contribution to human rights. And in that respect, I wanted to ask to the EBRD, we are in the Finance in Common, so how do you work with other PDBs in exchanging your experience and addressing some of the challenges that you face, including in doing a positive contribution to human rights, and perhaps think, like we were talking in the previous panel about SDG alignment, to have perhaps a human rights alignment for the PDBs in all their business model. Thank you.
Thank you, San. And I know that Adonai has to rush to another panel, so I would like to give him a chance to answer right now before we take a few more questions.
Thank you, Joanna. Two quick points. I didn't say that we only work ex ante, is that we focus ex ante, but we need to rebalance our focus also on monitoring. So that one point. And the second point I made that is not entirely what you said is, we do try to enhance and add value to our projects also through our safeguards. It's not just about doing no harm. In my closing remarks I pointed out that we want to provide substantial contribution to also the local communities, right? But I do understand that we need to work with other public development banks, and for that we have multiple working groups on different areas, from climate finance to biodiversity, to social issues. And we specifically have a working group with multilateral financial institutions that meets every year, where we share what are the challenges that we face in implementing and in updating our environmental social policies. So, and that working group feeds not just from our experience, but also from the experience we get by working with the civil society and with stakeholders and with affected communities. So the issue of remedies, the issue of biodiversity, the issue of human rights is discussed extensively and brainstormed on how to improve our policies. So we do look into these things. And your feedback is essential for us to do our work better. That's how I would respond to this.
Thank you, Adonai. I've seen a few hands in that area. Maybe the lady in the second row.
I am Bettina Cruz. I, as Benicia indigenous community member from the south of Mexico. Yesterday, I asked a question, but nobody replied to my question on whether this development model only has led to impoverishment or to these natural disasters, but are rather social disasters. So why you insist on using the same development model if this is not working? It's not working for most of the people, but is a model that it works for the banks, for some governments, and it works for just 1% of the global population that has the wealth of this world. They are promoting these infrastructure corridors to move the products. They are proposing energy transition, that in my land we have 29 wind parks with 3,000 generators, and we don't have benefits for the community. It's just the opposite situation. We had wind as a god, and wind has become a merchandise. Wind with these turbines is killing birds, contaminating the soil, the water, with no benefits. And every time the electricity that we have to pay is more expensive. This is a development based on development of nature and people. Okay, these are the risks that you have to take into account when these investments reach the territories. In Mexico right now, in this context of these corridors, we have a geographical reconfiguration that is taking place in the southeastern part of Mexico with investment from the European Bank of Investment, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and others banks. They are destroying the Maya jungle. They are destroying the Tehuantepec Isthmus territory with a corridor with 12 industrial parks and trains, and to transform merchandise in products, merchandise that we don't use, merchandise that we would not have access to these products that are being developed. This is the development you are speaking about to promote, to incentivize companies. IDB announced $200 million to motivate companies, to give incentives to companies to go to Tehuantepec Isthmus to destroy these companies that lead to sex type of trade, to impoverishment, and the government is reducing by 90% taxes. There is a tax cut for these companies of 90%. So what are we going to have left in the region? We don't see much. $200 million are for the companies. 90% discount tax cut is for companies. So what about people? What are we going to get in our territory? What do we have left? As our sister said, we need resources, but not to be invested over us, but on us. We need to recover our rivers that have been affected by this model of development. We have to recover many things. Where is the money for the communities? We don't see the money. It's just for companies, and this is clear evidence. Thank you.
I will allow the speakers to consider if they want to take up this difficult question, and I would like to give the chance to, yes, right there. He was very adamant that he should get the speaking slot.
Muchas gracias al auditorio y especial.
Thank you to the audience and to the colleague Darío that is representing us at the UN, and our sister of Ecuador. I want to speak about 3 points. First, to present the reality of Latin America, South America, and to tell the audience, the left and the right, they have the same idea, the same thoughts, because these are ideas that come from the Western anthropocentric ideas. They consider nature as an object to be exploited, and they think about one single ideal of development. is an example of the American leftist governments have destroyed, has displaced, contaminated, flooded the native Indian territories. The case of Brazil with President Lula in Singu and the dam that was built in spite of measures taken in the Human Rights Committee and the spite of the inter-American system of human rights. President Lula decided to build this. Our sister of Ecuador, they have the same situation with President Correa. And likewise, it has happened in the Madeira River with President Evo Morales and in the President Hugo Chavez. The same thing has happened everywhere. So these indigenous people, we think from our own minds, and as the President Darío Mejía said when stating that this is not us, and he said this very clearly, we, the indigenous peoples, we are not a minority. We, indigenous peoples, not a social sector. We, indigenous people, are not civil society. We, indigenous people, are not ethnias. We, indigenous people, are not vulnerable population. We, Indian populations, indigenous populations, are not just one single variable. We, indigenous populations, are collective subjects of rights. We are the real protectors of life, and we are in the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Indigenous People, and we take care of life through our systems of ideas, as has been presented by our sister from the Amazon region. Now, what are we stating globally? We have been convened today by financial institutions and by multilateral organizations. The Inter-American Bank, the Committee of Banking Supervision, ECBB, the ECIFI, the G8 and G20. We demand these multilateral institutions the comprehensive repair to the indigenous people. We demand the possibility to say no to free consent, informed consent, to prior and informed consultation, binding for any type of financing of extractive and fossil projects. Application of the 1-for-1 rule. It means the investment and loans of the fossil industry. Any dollar that is loaned for fossil investment has to be lent for protection of human rights and for protection of the environment. We request and demand multilateral organizations and UN to get support, design, and implement regulations so that human rights and environmental rights will prevail on public profits and private profits. We request concrete measures to decolonize the financial institution for decision-making to be pluralistic, more democratic, and not corporate. And as people from the South, we request that the debt will be a colonial debt, and illegitimate debt should be pardoned for these countries.
Reiterating some of the recommendations that have come from some of the speakers on the panel and their asks, I would like to give a chance to all of you, or some of you, to answer the very difficult question that came from the lady from West Mexico, if we need a whole model of development altogether. I'm trying to summarize a very long intervention, so I apologize if I'm not kind of getting at the gist of it. But if you have any reflections on this rather existential question, please go ahead. You're the brave one, Claudia.
I do not have the answer. I think it's important to recognize that active listening to concerns of all stakeholders is really important. I don't think it's the purpose to come really with, with very specific responses, because there are so many factors involved. But I want to come back to what I said earlier. I do really think taking stakeholder engagement much more seriously, as all of us have been saying, moving from ideas to do no harm to going much further than that, and to really trying to facilitate positive progress, I think are really elements to, and we all have tools. The ILO has lots of standards, labor standards, Convention 169 being one of them, but it is more about how we practice those things and how we really do more, go further than just a commitment into the action. It's basically what all of us have been saying, but I do think it's some level of answer to the question, which at the same time, I think it's very important to deeply listen to that and to what it means. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice, do you want to say a few words?
Thank you very much. I'd like to, first of all, thank the colleagues from Latin America who have spoken, and our colleague from Africa who have spoken based on the lived experiences of communities. Because they're speaking from the heart, they're speaking about what is being experienced. I do not have an answer to the existential question, but I wanted to say that it's very clear that the thinking around the dominant development paradigm, which is utilized, which is very close to a neoliberal way of seeing the world, which is then manifested. We talked about profit being more important than people, where economics are very important, where GDP is that which is used to define whether a country is successful or not. Really, perhaps, if we trace it back, is really rooted in an individualistic approach to how one sees self. On the other hand, colleagues have spoken about the collectivist nature of identity. And it's very common. We have similar ways of seeing ourselves also from Africa. You may be familiar with the word Boto or Ubuntu, which Archbishop Tutu used to talk about, where as an individual, I cannot exist in a vacuum. I am human because you are human. I am part of a shared humanity. And one of the challenges which one has, therefore, if the starting points are different, where our starting point would be the collective, would be the community, right? Within the cultural context, within the cultural space. And you've spoken about different ways of spiritual seeing. Somebody spoke about the need for decolonization earlier on, where we need to recognize that knowledges have been made invisible, knowledges have been made irrelevant, and they've been pushed aside, and other knowledges have taken priority and precedence. The notion of who one is, the indigenous peoples who have spoken are very clear about who they are, their being. They know who their being is. And I think, though, we've got to recognize that we're also engaging with a very unequal power relationship. It's a fact. And how we try and navigate our ways around that. I don't have an answer. I'm merely saying I hear and I understand, also based on my own lived experience as somebody from the global south. And how we navigate those spaces when then engaging at the global level with very different historical experiences, shaping of reality, and prioritization. That's all I can say. I did not answer the question, but just pointed out the concerns.
Thank you, Alice. And for the sake of time, I would say that we should continue the conversation on the whole, right? And I would like to kind of ask you to, join me in thanking the speakers for sharing their knowledge, for sharing their struggles. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of discussions on human rights at the summit.
I agree we need a different development paradigm. That was what the summary was, which I wanted to say. And the question is the how, right?
Yes, thank you.
Bueno, quiero agradecer a nuestros oradores, panelistas y a todos ustedes por ser parte de esta conversación crucial sobre los derechos.
I want to thank you for being part of this conversation on human rights. We cannot speak about building a just and a world with equity without centering human resources in this part. This is the last part of this meeting or this. Please enjoy the break and remember that after this break we'd have 4 panel discussion. We'd have panel 5, innovative financing for gender equity. 13, roundtable, climate to nature-related risk, lessons learned, how to advance. Roundtable 14, the underestimated role of public banks in water financing and sanitation. Panel 15, take advantage of data and artificial intelligence. At 1, we'd have a light lunch to meet again at the closing ceremony with the participation of the President of the Republic of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, at 1:30 p.m.